The lights in Paris were blinding. Grand Palais was a cathedral of couture that night, a temple built for fashion gods and crowned by the Forrester name. Outside, paparazzi crushed into velvet ropes. Inside, influencers whispered predictions, stylists adjusted last-minute stitches, and every runway light burned with anticipation. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of Forrester International's year. Instead, it became a battlefield. Brooke Logan stepped off the plane with one mission, end the charade. Rumors had reached her like whispers wrapped in knives. Ridge Forrester, the man she'd loved for decades, the father of her children, the architect of her heartbreak and healing, was reportedly entangled with a rising French designer half his age. Amelia, a darling of the avant-garde scene, praised for her fresh reinvention of Forrester tradition. But Brooke knew better. Reinvention was one thing. Theft was another. She didn't wait for security. She didn't bother with subtlety. She arrived at the Grand Palais like a storm dressed in silk. No publicist, no handler, just decades of fire behind her eyes. The show was already in motion, music pulsing beneath the glass dome, models strutting in structured gowns that shimmered like weaponized fabric. Applause rumbled. Cameras flashed. But backstage, chaos simmered just beneath the surface. Brooke bypassed guards, ducked past coordinators, and found herself in the designer pit, where Amelia stood surrounded by interns, basking in the chaos she claimed to command. Brooke didn't wait. She pulled out a rolled sketchbook from her bagoni she'd found tucked away in Ridge's old design vault in LA. Long-forgotten renderings marked Spring Archive -2005. They were unmistakable. Every drape, every angle, every exaggerated silhouette now being paraded on the Paris runway was already on that paper. Ridge's paper. Brooke threw it on the table in front of Amelia. "This collection isn't yours," Brooke said, her voice like steel. "You didn't create it. You recycled it. You repackaged Ridge's old work and called it genius. But I recognize his lines, his folds, his signature." Amelia didn't blink. She smiled, cold and defiant. "And yet, he gave it to me." "What does that say about you?" gasps echoed. Ridge, standing nearby, stepped forward, torn between control and collapse. He didn't deny it. His silence was betrayal in slow motion. Brooke's eyes locked on his. "You knew," she said, breathless. "You let her parade your past like it was her future. And you stood there." Amelia stepped closer, emboldened by the cameras now gathering behind them. "I didn't steal anything. I elevated it. Forrester needed relevance. Nostalgia sells, Brooke. I just added edge." Brooke's slap came before she thawed. A crisp, cinematic crack that shattered every backstage illusion of civility. Amelia stumbled back, gasping not in pain, but in shock. Then she retaliated. She didn't slap. She shoved two hands to Brooke's chest, knocking her against the dressing mirror, sending a tray of pins and fabric crashing to the marble floor. Interns screamed. Assistants tried to intervene. But it was too late. A camera crew streaming live behind-the-scenes footage to millions got every second. The moment was instantly viral. Forrester fight exploded on social media. Viewers, stunned, watched in real time as a luxury fashion show unraveled into raw scandal. The crescendo came when Amelia stormed toward the finale prep area, screaming for her crown, the bridal showpiece. A sweeping avant-garde wedding gown intended to close the show and solidify her as the new face of Forrester International. But Brooke blocked her path. "You walk that runway in his dress? You're not just a fraud," she hissed, voice shaking with fury. "You're a disgrace. And I'll burn this brand down before I let you claim it." That was when Steffi appeared, heels clicking like gunshots on marble. She had been watching from the sidelines, aware of the whispers, but unprepared for the explosion. Her face was pale, her phone buzzing with alerts as stock values for Forrester creations began plummeting live on the market, triggered by the scandalous feed. "Shut it down," she ordered. "Kill the finale." But the dress Amelia started. "I said shut it down," Steffi roared. And the music stopped. Just like that. The crowd outside, expecting a final act, was met with confusion, then frustration. Lights dimmed, models paused, and then the screen behind the runway went dark. Backstage, Ridge stood between Brooke and Amelia, speechless. Two worlds collapsing around him, his legacy and his latest obsession. His silence had created this monster. His refusal to choose had sparked this war. Brooke turned to him one last time. "I didn't come to Paris to rescue you. I came to remind you who you are. You built Forrester on family, on trust. You throw that away for her, and you don't just lose me. You lose everything." Rich tried to speak, but the words were too late. Brooke was already walking away, blood still pounding in her ears. Steffi looked at her father with barely concealed contempt. "Fix it," she told him, "or resign." The next day, headlines were merciless. Forrester Paris show ends in violence. Accusations. Rich Forrester's legacy in question after design theft scandal. Brooke Logan strikes back. Amelia tried damage control, issuing a vague apology on Instagram. But the damage was done. Investors pulled out. Partnerships were reevaluated. The bridal collection was pulled from the market. Social media sided with Brooke. Memes turned her slap into legend. Behind closed doors, Rich faced the fallout. The board demanded a decision. His reputation was tarnished. And Amelia, once radiant in the glow of fresh fame, now sat alone in the same atelier she had once ruled, ostracized and discarded. Brooke didn't wait for him to call. She made it clear before she left: pick your path, family or fantasy. Because you don't get both. And for the first time in years, Ridge realized the runway wasn't where the real drama happened. It was at home, in the spaces between loyalty and lust, between ego and legacy. Paris had crowned no one, but it had unmasked everyone. Florence was supposed to be a retreat. That's how Ridge framed it to the press, to the board, and maybe even to himself. After the Paris scandal and the implosion of the Forrester International Showcase, he claimed he needed space to reset, to find beauty again. But behind the PR spin was the truth. Rich had flown to Italy with Amelia Laurent, the woman at the center of the controversy, the woman Brooke had publicly unmasked as a fraud. What no one knew, what Rich himself didn't know, is that this trip wasn't about inspiration. It was a trap. The story began with a postcard. It arrived at Brooke's doorstep without a return address. The image was a painting Botticelli's Primavera, the goddess of spring dancing in a garden of secrets. But on the back, in ink only she would recognize, were 3 words: Via dell'Inferno. Beneath that, a scrawled date, and a signature that looked eerily familiar, decades old but unforgettable. It sent a chill down her spine. That name once belonged to the man who nearly destroyed Forrester Creations during its formative years. A ruthless European investor, Charles Dumas, who had manipulated contracts, bribed partners, and almost bankrupted the family before Eric forced him out. The damage took years to repair, and now somehow was back. Or at least, his ghost was. Brooke knew only one person in Ridge's orbit who might be connected: Amelia. Young, French, sudden, and always too confident. She hadn't just appeared, she had positioned herself. Brooke booked the next flight to Florence. Meanwhile, Ridge and Amelia were staying in a secluded villa outside the city, the kind of place old artisans used to dye fabrics by hand, now converted into a private studio. He thought they were collaborating on a comeback line. She told him she needed solitude and trust, no distractions, no interference. She convinced him to keep the sketches off the grid, not send them to Forrester LA. It has to be pure, she whispered. No one else can touch it until it's done. They locked the doors. They worked under candlelight. Rich began to see visions of the Renaissance in her designs. He felt inspired. He felt needed. He didn't realize he was being used. By the time Brooke landed, she had already dug through old archives and uncovered what no one had connected. Amelia Laurent was born Amelia Dumas, daughter of Charles Dumas. Her mother had changed their name after the scandal in the 90s, but the trail was still there. Paris boarding schools funded by shell corporations, anonymous investors in her early collections. And more damning still, a recent contract signed between Amelia and a known rival fashion conglomerate that had once tried to buy out Forrester Creations. Buried in the fine print was a clause, exclusive first rights to any design created during her collaboration with Ridge. It wasn't amuse. It was espionage. Brooke followed the clues to the address on the postcard, an old textile mill on Via dell'Inferno, long abandoned, now privately owned and suspiciously guarded. She waited until nightfall. Then she broke in. Inside, the corridors were narrow and ancient, filled with the smell of dust and iron. She heard Ridge's voice, low and intent, and Amelia's, coaxing, performative. Brooke crept down the hall. In one chamber, lit only by a single desk lamp, Ridge and Amelia were bent over a new dress form. The gown was stunning. Draped silk layered with metallic accents and abstract florals. But it wasn't new. Brooke recognized the structure was a manipulation of a dress from Ridge's very first collection with Eric in the 80s. The folds, the structure had history. She stepped into the light. "He's not your partner," Brooke said. "He's your blueprint." Ridge looked up in shock. Amelia dropped her sketchpad. "You were never designing with him. You were extracting him. And now I have the proof." Amelia tried to bluff, but Brooke pulled out the contract she'd printed from her hotel, highlighted and annotated. Ridge grabbed it. His hands trembled as he read the terms. Then the real betrayal sank in. The entire Florence trip was a staged operation to funnel intellectual property through Amelia to Forrester's competitor. She had used his name, his signature, and his legacy. "I trusted you," Ridge said, voice raw. "You were useful," Amelia replied coldly. "And sentimental. Easy to manipulate." Ridge stepped back, stunned. Brooke, furious, stepped forward. "You think you're clever, hiding behind lineage and romance. But you're nothing but a thief playing designer." Amelia lunged, trying to snatch the papers from Brooke's hands. The scuffle turned violent. Brooke shoved her back into the fabric rack. Amelia grabbed a seam ripper, slashing it toward the sketches. Brooke blocked her, and the chaos spilled into the hallway. Ridge tried to intervene, but Amelia ran, bolting down the stone corridors. Brooke followed. They raced through the twisting passageways of the ancient mill, past rusted sewing machines and crates of untouched fabric, their footsteps echoing like war drums. Outside, the Via's night guard heard the commotion and called the police. By the time the Italian authorities arrived, Amelia had barricaded herself in the main atelier, screaming about intellectual rights and creative license. Brooke handed over the documents, including copies of sketches Ridge had signed, dated years ago, matching the designs Amelia now claimed as her own. The Italian officers didn't hesitate. They detained Amelia on suspicion of fraud and violation of contract law. Ridge stood stunned, the pieces falling apart around him. "She used me," he said, barely able to process it. Brooke didn't gloat. She just said, "You gave her the keys to your kingdom. I came to take them back." The next morning, the news broke. Forrester scandal in Florence, designer arrested in espionage scheme. The fashion world imploded again. Investors demanded answers. Brooke and Ridge flew home on the same jet, quiet at first. Then Ridge turned to her. "You saved me." Brooke looked out the window. "No, I saved us." When they landed in Los Angeles, Brooke walked ahead through the private terminal, Ridge following behind, finally understanding the cost of his ego. Amelia remained in Florence, under investigation, facing charges and lawsuits from both Forrester and the Italian Fashion Council. Her career was over before it truly began. Back at the Forrester offices, Steffi had already locked down their legal team and initiated damage control. The sketches were secured. The contracts burned. And for the first time in weeks, the company felt steady again. Brooke sat in Eric's old chair during the emergency board meeting. She didn't need to say much. The room knew what she had done. And Ridge. He didn't speak either. He just took his place beside her, not as a man chasing inspiration, but as a designer finally reminded who he was without illusion. The war was over? For now. But the runway remembers everything. And so does Brooke.
Oh.